Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Phil Englert. I lead the Medical Device Security Initiative here at Health-ISAC, and I want to talk about medical device security and the role that the biomeds, HTM, clinical engineers, whatever you choose to call yourself, have in securing medical devices in the healthcare environment. So again, I apologize that I cannot be there today. I'm recovering from an illness, and hopefully my voice will hold up for this entire presentation. So Health-ISAC, or is an ISAC, for those of you not familiar with it, that's an information sharing and analysis center. We're a member-driven organization. We have about 490 members organizations globally. ISACs were created in 2013 from a presidential decree declaring critical infrastructure, and critical infrastructure can be defined as any unit of business or businesses within the society that, if disrupted, could cause national security concern or civil unrest, if you get that. So think about space, aviation, transportation, retail and hospitality, health, water, nuclear, cargo, transportation, shipments, things like that. So all kinds of different ISACs exist. Chances are your organization is a member of Health-ISAC. We cover a large number of beds in the United States, as well as a large number of manufacturers. So where this is a little outdated, there's about 12,500 members, individuals that participate in the Health-ISAC. And you can see the kinds of organizations that provide healthcare providers, insurance, academic medical schools, manufacturers, the typicals, as well as telehealth, pharmacies, pharmaceutical laboratories, hospice, clearinghouses. And I was just after a recent board meeting, they're talking about adding animal care to that. So expanding beyond that, because there's so much overlap into that space. For that. So looking at Health-ISAC, you know, we've got a large number of the Fortune 500 healthcare companies, the top 51 global medical device manufacturers. Sorry about the slides and the overlay here. But a lot of large organizations. You can see here the kinds of members that we have, tier 1 being the smallest, tier 7 being the largest. And this really makes sense because, you know, there's not a large number of giant organizations as there are a lot of small healthcare organizations, you know, including physician practices, independent laboratory and diagnostic centers, so on and so forth. So we often leverage the capabilities, the capacities that these very large organizations have to the benefit of the very smallest organizations, who are often very stretched in their ability to provide healthcare. We don't advertise who the members of the organization are, but our board of directors is public. So you can see here we represent the full scale, from small healthcare organizations to the very largest pharma and manufacturing organizations in the thing. So as you all know, healthcare is under attack, right? It is constantly being attacked, and it has been that way for a number of years, and the rate only seems to be increasing. And as we continue to aggregate our connections to business partners, as we continue to aggregate healthcare delivery, the attack surface just continues to grow and makes it very much more difficult to protect. So some of you may be aware of this. Back in 2016, right, Hollywood Presbyterian, right, an urban healthcare level 3 trauma center, you know, serving a multicultural urban LA community, was rendered inoperable, right, back in 2016. Patients were diverted. They were taking patients out of the hospital and transferring them to other locations. Their hospital was on divert, right? Interestingly enough, they did call in the FBI, local law enforcement, right? They paid 40 Bitcoin, right? 10 days later, and they declared recovery on February 15th. And interestingly, the ransomware that hit them came in through Microsoft Word, right? So very common things that are in healthcare. It's not necessarily related directly to medical devices, but it does impact the healthcare environment. I bring this up because back in 2016, right, ransomware was still very immature. They were like, hey, we'll take whatever we can get. We won't make it too expensive, and people will be ready to pay. And certainly healthcare pays very quickly, and I believe that that's one of the reasons. But you can see that cost them $17,000 to do this. Now, Hollywood Presbyterian probably brings in, back in that day, about $1.4 million per day, right? So it was a pretty big loss. 10 days is a significant cost to them, right? By the numbers, what we see is the healthcare continues to get breached, and these are the number of breached entities, right? And you can see it just continues to climb up into the 800s in 2023, right? Interestingly enough, what we see too, and this is the point I make on this slide, is business associates, those who we give to do business with, continues to climb on this. And this is a very important piece. And the health plans seem to have kind of capped out at a part. So keep in mind, and you can see that the costs up here in the top continue to go. The average cost of the breach, right? The number of breaches that have, and the healthcare impact is in the billions, right? $8 billion in 2023. So it's not small change here. So we know that this is a challenge, right? And if we look again, this is the business associates and the number of records that were breached here. And I think I saw a statistic in 2023, about 32.5 million Americans had their healthcare records breached. That's 10%, of the American population. So it's a significant impact on us as patients, right? On healthcare providers and everybody in the supply chain. But again, you can see that because we become more reliant and more trusting of our business associates, when they get hit, they have more and more of our data, and that's a big piece that goes out into it. So a little bit background here. Surveys say we're not really as good as we ought to be, right? They say that healthcare is very, very like the weakest of the industries, if the industry sectors, if you will. And I look back to Colonial Pipeline, I look back to some other industries that have gotten breached, and what I see is they really didn't have the protections in place either. So I don't know whether healthcare is really just that much less prepared, that much less protected than other industries, or are we just really a bigger target? And I think that there's two things. One is that that HIPAA penalizes healthcare providers for any of the breaches that occur. So we're actually punishing the victim here. We got victim punishment going on, and that's one of the reasons that we're so likely to pay so fast. And I think that's the other thing, is we are willing to pay, and we get cyber insurance. We're paying very quickly, and so this is easy pickings. It's the low-hanging fruit for the ransomware folks, for the hackers, and that's one of the reasons we get there. But we could do a better job, right? 53% of healthcare IT staff say that the threat landscape is high or extreme, right? That kind of is obvious, but this is a hard number from a survey, right? Less than half say we always change default passwords on connected medical devices, and less than a third, always update them when a patch is available. And this is really, when we talk about medical devices, this piece down here is really the key. We are not getting patched, right, as frequently, as often as we can. The other thing is we don't have good empirical data for how often medical devices are impacted in a cyber event at a healthcare organization. And there's a couple reasons for this, but really I think it's the government is not collecting it. When we have to report breaches, medical devices is not a category that can be checked that say they were impacted by this. So there's no collection on the number of records that get breached through medical devices, even if they are only used as a pivot or a pivot point or an exfiltration point, data exfiltration point. The other thing is the FDA on their MAUD reporting, on their adverse event reporting, does not have cyber as an event cause. So we're not collecting it on the inbound side, on the FDA, on the medical device side. We're not collecting it on the larger data set. So we have very poor empirical data around how many times or how much of the medical device population is getting impacted. But if you think about one of our members, and I'll mention it because they were listed on the board of directors, and I've got permission from the CISO to use this, but Christiana Care in the Baltimore area, about a 7-hospital system. They've got about 70,000 connected endpoints, and 50,000 of those devices, those endpoints, are medical devices. And so that tells you just how dense, our medical device population is in a healthcare environment. Right? This happened in 2020 over in Dusseldorf, and this gained national or international attention because it was the first time that we thought that a cyber attack was involved in a homicide, right? That it caused the direct death. And what happened was there was a 78-year-old woman suffering from an aortic aneurysm. Right, Dusseldorf University had been on divert because they had been ransomed and they had no scanning. Their PAC system was offline. They just couldn't take in new patients here. And so this patient had to be diverted to another facility 20 miles away. Because of the terrain, it took about an hour to get there around windy mountainous roads, right? And the patient passed away. And so they were like, is this the first time we've got a ransomware attack, that we could attribute to a direct patient death, right? They thought it was there. The negligent homicide investigation determined that the patient was in such a state that regardless of which facility she showed up in, she was not going to survive. Right, so they kind of got there. But the interesting thing here, and you'll notice that this was a Russian-based group, and many of the attacks that we see today come from state-sponsored or state-allowed, if you will, hacker groups on here. But this group back in 2020, right, didn't realize that they were that they had crippled a hospital's ability. And when they found this out, they actually handed over the keys, the encryption keys, so that the hospital could get back online. They're like, we had no idea. And the reason I point this out is because, we've oftentimes, back when I was in industry, right, we would update devices and we'd find out later that it interrupted a clinical care, right? It was, we've got an analyzer, a blood analyzer in the lab. We've got an open patient on the table. They take it over and suddenly the device is rebooted because somebody updated the patch on the device. And so it delayed the ability to get the biologic statistics information that the doctors needed in order to continue on with the case, right? And so this happens because on the end of the wire, IT people cannot always discern the difference between a traditional computer that looks like a Windows box and a medical device or a chemistry analyzer that also looks like a Windows box. And so that inability to determine exactly what you're working at is why we're locking up servers over and over again in the healthcare environment. So the medical device healthcare environment in healthcare, right, is a tricky, complex world. And we'll look at it here, right? A couple things is these are purpose-built devices for hundreds of purposes, right? The FDA has over 560 product codes, the 3-letter codes, right, that they use for medical devices, for connected medical devices, I should say, right? They're also designed for precision and reliability, which means what? It means that these devices don't lend themselves to flexibility, right? You can't update and patch them. You have to check and make sure that updates and patches that come out, right, and are applied to the device don't interrupt clinical functionality, right? We also have a lot of technology debt. We've got devices that we've bought many years ago that continue to function. They do what they were bought to do. The clinical functionality still works fine, even though the security on them is not up to speed. So we've got this technology debt that we can still generate revenue. We can still do what it wants to do, what we want it to do, what we bought it to do, but it can't be done, given the security of the environment and the lack of security. We have lack of manufacturer transparency. And if you're a biomed, if you work in hospitals, excuse me so much, you would understand that the manufacturers would like you to believe that their equipment works by magic, and they want nothing They don't want people to really know or understand what's under the hood, right? We know that it's necessary for us to do that. There's a big fight for the, the right to repair around all of that. But it's a hard thing, and manufacturers are having a difficult time coming to this concept of transparency on this. And then there's software as a medical devices. And as biomeds, we're very good about putting stickers on it, whether they be barcoded or RFID'd in some way to, track an asset because it has, 6 walls or 6 walls, right, on it, the top, bottom, 2 sides, and the front and back. Right, so these are physical assets that we can touch. Software as a medical device is more ethereal, right? It's just it's just applications that can reside on anything, whether it's a tablet, whether it's a desktop, whether it's a mobile computer or even your phone, right, on here. So it's a little bit more of an asset management challenge for the biomeds, and we'll have to figure that out. What I see often in healthcare is that those software as a medical devices get handed off to the application owners, and they're not the responsibility of the biomeds, which is probably the right place for them to be. And then we think about not just the hundreds of purpose-built purposes, or the purpose-built hundreds of purposes, right? We've got major modalities, right? So there's imaging, and there's many different kinds of modalities for imaging, whether it's ultrasound, straight X-ray, portable X-ray, CTs, MRIs, spec systems, all the nuclear med stuff, all of that. So even the kinds of modalities get broken down, and then the patient monitoring, whether it's acute care, whether it's ambulatory monitoring, all of that, the hundreds, of therapeutic devices, and then the diagnostic stuff that we're using day in and day out. And not only that, but in healthcare itself, there's not just medical devices, but there's all kinds of other things. How do we keep the environment safe and comfortable for our patients? So the HVAC systems, the utilities that we use, the life safety, fire control, water control, medical gases, all of that, transportation systems, whether it's elevators or the tube system, are all necessary in order to deliver patient care in acute care settings. And so it's important that these be controlled and managed just as well. So the FDA has observed medical device vulnerabilities all kinds of different times on them, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but they've seen malware on stuff like this. They've got uncontrolled distribution of passwords, and we've just gotten better at hiding passwords, but we still use a lot of system passwords there. And then this is the one that I always feel the worst about: the failure to provide timely security software updates and patches, right? So Microsoft has Patch Tuesday, and every time they find a vulnerability, they're working very quick to get it patched, and then it takes 6, 12, 18 months for a manufacturer to assess whether that patch is okay to apply to a medical device. And that delay is a huge disincentive for healthcare providers to update that. And the interesting dichotomy of it is once the manufacturer gets it out, they expect you to apply it very quickly. And I'm like, well, you really haven't rushed to get there, so why are we called upon to rush now? And we've got to solve that problem from a logistics, and what that's really going to take is good coordination, good cooperation with our medical device partners. So things that used to not be connected today are, and this list could be super big, right? But things that didn't exist, the insulin pumps that are controlled by readers, right? To do that, monitors that we use for PAC systems that used to just be a monitor, and now you've got to calibrate them periodically for how good their image resolution is, right? But they have connectivity and they have processing capabilities within them, right? And then things like anesthesia carts, which previously, and back when my hair was blonde and not gray, right? These were simply pneumatic, and tube systems, right? They were really gas delivery systems that were based on physical properties, and now they're connected, right? So that we can monitor the gas flows, we can monitor the pressures, we've got separate monitors for, consciousness of the patient and the stability of that. So, there's a couple of things going on here. We're expanding we're developing technologies to do marvelous things with healthcare. It's amazing. It's very cool. It's what keeps me excited about being in this space, year after year, day after day. But the thing is as we develop these new technologies, as we connect technologies that were not previously connected. If you think about the light system in an OR, used to be just that. It was a light system, right? It was 2 or 3 big things, and the only thing you had to worry about was focusing and directing the light into the right space of the surgical theater. Right now, the light system is the communication center, nerve center for the entire OR, right? And so adding these capabilities to these previously dumb devices, if you will, just lends ourselves, builds that threat surface, makes it so that those of us that maintain these devices now have another element to maintain, right? The Internet of Things, I'm sure you've witnessed this over the course of, your career, the course of your life. Is just, we are doing more and more with everything, and it's just getting huge, right? So it's going to be $1 trillion, or was $1 trillion industry in 2023. It's going to be 24. By 2030, they'll go to 24 billion devices. Think about that. And the population of the Earth, that's like 12 devices per person, on the world. And it's incredible what it is, and how much it goes. And healthcare spends a lot on that. And part of it is the fact that we're constantly investing in new technologies, new treatments, on that. And so, it's almost, 16% of our GDP in 2019 is a pretty significant portion of that. For that, we're spending about $12,000 per person, on healthcare in 2021. A lot of money is in here, and a lot of money to be made. If we think about basic systems, right, this is the connectivity. This is an infusion pump system, and it's about as basic as it gets, right? You've got the vendor comes in through a firewall, right? Through an access point, we're connecting the pump server to the pump and either exchanging information. It used to just be we were delivering drug libraries. Now we're monitoring the pumps for what they are, for usability, for the time that they're actually in service, for what their drug deliveries were. They're even collecting patient data, through the scanner and putting all of that stuff together. So we're building this access point, but this is about as basic as we get. As we get into the more complex things, we've got, a diagnostic imaging adds a lot of different things. So it's not just one technology. We've got a number of technologies, whether it's PET, MRI, CT, other imaging things. We're pushing this stuff out to, PACS workstations, DICOM viewers, right? And we're also connecting it to all of these different partners and all of these different applications where we're collecting information from the HIS, goes to the RIS, does the order scheduling, right? Excuse me, sends that information over to the imaging modalities, collects it back, pushes it into the EHR, sends it over to the reporting workstation. It may go out to the physician's offices, or wherever it may be, right? Or even made available to the patients themselves these days. So the network continues to get more complex. If you're interested in this, NIST special publication 1800-24 on securing PACS is a nice study for understanding that. There's also one here, and I don't have the reference number for the imaging or for the pump system. And then the last one that they did was telehealth remote patient monitoring. And I bring this up because this brings in more of the layers, right, of the business layers, like what do we do? But it also has the patient home, the telehealth platform provider, and we see this a lot more, where the information is coming off a medical device that generates some of this PHI, right? And we send it up to the cloud where it's then managed, let's say manipulated, if you will, and then handed back down or sent to the HDOs for consumption and for treatment. And so in the middle of the treatment chain, we now have a third party involved, and these are those third party business associates that are now managing this data for us. And it's important to understand that we've got that. So that the environment, it gets more complex, not just in what we're doing, right? But also in the partners that we have to have within our ecosystem in order to deliver these healthcare capabilities. And there's not just that, there's every one of these locations has infrastructure, and you've got the patient home, which is very tough. You don't know whether it's, an urban setting, a rural setting, whether they're relying on, satellite for their internet capability, whether they've got old technology, newer technology, what that looks like. If you're, as we push healthcare into the home environment, now we've got maybe multiple different modalities in the home that are not necessarily interoperable with each other. So you've got multiple connections that have to be managed and maintained. And so it's going to continue to get more and more complex as it goes. And as biomeds, we'll have to consider what this looks like and how we're doing it and how we're going to manage this. So believe it. The healthcare matrix, right? 6,400 acute care hospitals. And we've got the traditional healthcare system, but we've also pushed a lot of healthcare into the precursor. So the primary care physicians, diagnostic imaging centers that can share information with an acute care setting if it gets there, off-site surgical centers, things like that. So we've got a number of, we're kind of flattening out the healthcare thing where instead of it all just happening in the acute care setting, it's now happening before in the pre-care and then also in the post-care, whether we're sending them home, sending them to clinics, having a rehabilitation. So it just gets more and more complex, and then weave into that, all of the different kinds of technologies, and you can see just how complex these connections are, right? Regulatory guidance. Doing okay here for time. So the FDA in 2022, actually in 2023, March of 2023 is when it became effective. But through the Omnibus Appropriations Bill, right, the Omnibus Bill, they have what's called Section 524B, right, which granted the FDA statutory authority for cybersecurity of medical devices. Prior to that, the FDA only had statutory authority for safety of medical devices. And while the Venn diagram does overlap, right, it wasn't always as clear. There was a big gray area. So this was landmark policy making in the government. It's sometimes referred to as the Patch Act. And it's not exactly the Patch Act, but it follows what was proposed as the Patch Act pretty closely on there. So so this was groundbreaking. It's going to change how the FDA regulates medical devices for manufacturing. And remember, that's their goal, that's their thing, is are we making safe and effective devices that can be marketed for use, for clinical use in the United States? That's their mission, right? Not to regulate it once it's in the space. That's really CMS, and JACO and the healthcare provider themselves take care of those that are there. A couple of things that they have, and I just have a side-by-side here, right? But secure by design, right? Meaning that you have to build devices that are secure. When security became an issue, a lot of manufacturers started to add security to their devices. But what we found and what we experienced was the security that was added was really just what was available on the platform they had chosen to deliver the clinical functionality. So if that Windows embedded system could do encryption, they might add encryption. But if it couldn't, then they weren't adding it. So what we got was patches of security by design or security on these devices in this interim. Now new devices that go through the regulatory review have to be secure by design, meaning that security has to be built in from the beginning. They also have to plan to monitor, identify, and address in a reasonable time post-market cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And unlike physical properties that can be engineered, like how long is this belt going to last or this filter going to last before it has to be changed, right? Cybersecurity it's a human-driven piece. It's bad actors finding a way to break in. And this Inconsistency adds chaos to it. It means that it's not predictable from a physics calculation. And so that is difficult to plan for as a product manufacturer. Software bill of materials, including commercial, open source, and off-the-shelf software components. So this is that breakdown. This is that expansion of transparency, the opening of the aperture. What are the components that make up the device that I now make, right? That I now have in my environment. They have to demonstrate a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, right? And there has to be third-party data transparency. So you can see that the FDA pre-market guidance also aligns with this. And the FDA's got now in comment period that should be closing at the end of this month, I believe, a special update for the omnibus bill, which is their interpretation of what this means from a regulatory environment. So more to come from that area. So a couple of highlights, right? Quality systems regulations. So I think this was a brilliant piece that the FDA put in, right? They said that if your device could be made to do something it was not intended to do, then that's a quality problem and the manufacturers need to address it. So rather than trying to come up with what are the security requirements for 550 or 560 or more than 560 different product categories, right? They just said, whatever your device is designed to do, it must not, you have to protect it from somebody getting in and changing what that is so they can't do that. So they also made the link that cybersecurity is patient safety, right? Again, if you can alter the function of a device, that's a patient safety thing. Some of the recalls that we have seen have to do without changing medication dosages, right? Whether it's on an infusion pump or on another type of, an insulin pump on a patient for personal use. So those are things. They've got to have a secure product development framework, which means that's really just secure by design. It's a whole framework of these are the steps that have to go through on there. The security objectives must drive the security requirements and the security controls. And so this is that top-down cascading, right? So what do you need to do? What risks do you introduce? What are the impacts if those risks are exploited? And so what are the controls that you must have in place to protect against that exploitation, right? On that. And so this is a cascading thing so that you can drive or develop those cybersecurity commensurate with the risk that you're introducing, into your customer's environment for that. Cybersecurity and transparency and labeling, we know, and we have a big opportunity. We know how poor the MDS2 was. I hear manufacturers complain a lot, right? That I supply the MDS2 and then they give, the HDO gives me a 270 question questionnaire, and that's because we don't trust the MDS2 to provide the information that we need. Right? The SBOM is an opportunity for manufacturers to help correct that, provide true and accurate information so that we as consumers, we as the owners of this device, can understand the risks that we have within the context of the risk environment and the risk tolerance, the risk appetite that we have as an organization, and manage that risk for ourselves. But we need information in order to do that, right? Security risk management. If you participate on the environment of care committees are involved with that, that security risk management or risk management is what healthcare does. Security risk management is just that piece. How do we protect, the availability, the integrity, and the confidentiality of the information and the code that we have on there. And then threat modeling, security architecture, and cybersecurity testing, right? So threat modeling is identifying what can go wrong here, right? And then the security architecture is how did we design to prevent that going wrong, right? And the cybersecurity testing is what did we do to verify that the controls that we put in place in our security architecture actually are effective in, preventing the threats that we've identified. So a couple of things, you can see that it's lots of layers building up on this. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time. These are kind of leave behind slides as you get, but you can see, there's some real things here. But you can see that authenticity includes integrity, authorization, availability, confidentiality, and secure and timely updatability and patchability. I'm talking with the FDA. This is what they're really focusing on this year. I don't know whether they'll change it or how fast it will change, right? But I'm looking forward to the point where we can get these patches out and get them into the hands of the HDOs and get these devices, updated and at least close the risks that we're aware of. That's the real trick there. A couple other things. This is the one that gets me every time, right? So this is a tragedy that could have been prevented, right? Down in Spring Hill Medical Center in Alabama in 19, a mother was not informed during admission, 8 days into a cyber attack, that they were crippled in some of their capability. One of the key capabilities was their central monitoring for their birthing unit, right? So they didn't have fetal monitoring in a central station for that. The fetus went into distress, right? An umbilical cord wrapped, right? So the nuchal wrap is what they call it. It happens in about 10% of births, detected earlier. It's manageable, right? It's not an emergency situation, but without the ability to centrally monitor that it was not detected until it was a critical situation. They did an emergency C-section, after removing the baby. They resuscitated it. The infant survived for about 9 months before passing up. So it's in the court, is this the first confirmed death, due to a cyber event? We talked about Dusseldorf, and this was here. This was recently settled in 2024 and under the usual cloak, undisclosed amount, no admission of wrongdoing at all. So there's no real studies. But when I talk to folks about this, there were clinical steps that could have happened to prevent this. It wasn't just a cyber breakdown. But what I look at is that this CVE in 2018, right, was actually discovered in September of 2018, and Microsoft patched it in October of 2018, well before this patient was there. So if this patch had been applied to this medical device, right, this attack may never have happened, right? May have been certainly preventable, right? And so you can see there's two different Windows 10, Server 2016. So depending on what it was there. So my point is, with quick patching, recognition and patching of devices, we can be preventing aspects like this, right, on here. So a security program, what do we do about it, right? And I'm here to tell you that, security, medical device security is no different than maintenance operations that biomeds do day in and day out, right? It's not, patching and updating devices is not dissimilar than doing preventive maintenance to ensure that, the latest security applications are applied, just like you change belts or used to change belts and filters to make sure that the device will not overheat, something won't break, and you'll be able to continue to operate the device. So it's preventive in nature, right? One of the challenges, we've got the breadth of technologies. We talked about that, the legacy devices. We've got some very old stuff in our environment, the variety of clinical care environments. And I say this because if you think about the CT that supports your emergency department, right, might be the same CT that's also out in your diagnostic imaging center out in the suburbs, right? But the impacts on the organization or on healthcare itself are different, right? If your CT that supports your ER goes down, your ER typically goes on divert. So your organization then loses the admissions that come in that would normally come in, right? You don't have those studies. So you lose the revenue on that. You maybe have damaged reputation, right? The ER or the CT that might be out in your diagnostic imaging center, you reschedule it. Maybe you ask them to go to the next town over, the next closest imaging center, come into the hospital maybe and get the study done if it needs to be done sooner. But it's not an emergent situation that can impact, healthcare delivery. We have multiple responsible parties, right? And dilution of priorities. And those two go hand in hand. So the ownership of medical devices is often fractured, right? There's the clinical owners that have to generate, take care of patients, generate revenue, so on and so forth. You've got IT that keeps the things connected. They're trying to apply the standards that they have. You've got the biomed teams, or even sometimes it's the manufacturers that are trying to keep the things up and running and available to provide, the cases, the studies that they do. And then there's the regulatory uncertainty, because it's a changing world and we're still figuring out how all that works. On the right here, we've got the multiple supply chains, and the healthcare supply chain looks down here, and these have, pre-procurement, procurement, installation, monitoring, decommissioning. That's the normal medical device life cycle, but you can see that there's a lot of contributing pieces that go into that, whether it's in the upper right where the manufacturer is selecting components that go into their medical devices. They have to go through all of the processes to make sure that this device is there. They push it out to the customers, right? And they also push it out to their service support teams, their customer service teams, often disconnected. And when I talk to service support teams about cybersecurity, I get two answers. One, they don't know, and two, I do whatever they tell me to do, but they don't fully understand how that impacts. And we're hoping to change that conversation. So for a cybersecurity program, this looks no different than your MEMP, your medical equipment management plan, right? It's the same thing. How do we govern and operate, right? How do we do secure procurement? How do we maintain, install it, and maintain it? How do we monitor, respond, and dispose of equipment, right? This is the same thing. It's just a different aspect of it. So it's not the physical properties of the device. It's now sometimes that electronic, that interoperability aspect of the device that's on there. So this should not be foreign to you as an HTM professional, right? I love this one, right? You guys know what to do. This is no different, but I know a biomed put this on. You can see, in case of cyber attack, break the glass and pull the cables, right? And this looks like a mess. What I love about this is right here is a watering can and a plot right next to all the electricity. So, because we're fearless as HTMs on there. But HTM job is maintenance operations, right? Cyber is a failure mode. That's all it is, right? It's a way for things not to work, or not to work as expected, when and where needed, right? So our job here is to anticipate and respond. And the reason I say this is, think about this, right? If that CT in the ER, right, were to lose its tube, excuse me, a couple of things would happen, right? You would know where you're getting that tube from, right? How long it's going to take to land on your loading dock if you've not already anticipated that the tube was going to fail and had it pre-staged, right? How long it would take you to install it and calibrate it, and when you could return that unit back to clinical operations, right? When the rad director can get their ER back online. We have to think about if the device were to go out because of a cyber event, right? If my hard drive gets corrupt, what am I going to do? How am I going to get this device back online? Am I going to call in the manufacturer and have them rebuild the system? And if so, do I have all the configuration settings? Do I have all the communication settings stored somewhere? Does IT have it? Is it in my CMMS? We have to think about that. We have to think about, how do we recover? How do we return this device back to clinical operations? That's the real key. Anticipate and respond. It's what biomeds do day in and day out, every day of their lives, right? They're like firefighters. The phone rings, you pick it up. Yep, I'll be right there. You go up and you fix it, and then by the time you get back to the shop, the phone has already rung 5 times, and you're off to the next thing. We have to treat cyber the same way. So think about how that might look in your organization. So the operating model for your MEMP, right, has these pieces, and I'm not going to go over this because you're more familiar with it than I am, right? But governance is who makes what decisions, and this is where it becomes complex in the healthcare environment because of that fractured ownership, right? Who can authorize an update? Who can make sure that the device is not in clinical use when somebody wants to remote into your device and update the patch the device, right? How do we make sure? Who do we call if it goes down, right? What is the environment of care, right? What are the performance improvement plans? How are we going to get better? How are we going to monitor this stuff, right? Who has the spending authority? If I have to buy a new hard drive so I can ghost it and have one pristine and ready to go, so that I can pull out a ransomed hard drive, hand it to my forensics team, let them do their job, put in, a pristine hard drive that we know is good, get the configuration settings, connect it back to the HIS and the RIS, and put that device back into service and start treating patients again, right? So that's the way we have to start thinking about stuff. Staff management and education and training is important, and training is hard. We've been doing it for a long time, and if you look at the results, it doesn't look like we're very effective at it. So rethink, your training on here. So a couple pieces here, right? The HTM, the biomeds, the clinical engineers, our job is to keep it running. This is maintenance operations. IT keeps it talking, and I've heard it described so many times, like I own this device up until it plugs into the wall, and then it's IT's from there on out, right? And we have to kind of get over that us and them mentality and start figuring out, like, how do we do this? Understand that safety changes impact security, and security changes impact safety. This is one of the reasons that it's difficult for manufacturers to just take a Microsoft patch on any given Tuesday, apply it to their device, and then send that out to the HDOs to make sure that it's up there, right? Because we don't know if we're going to change the functionality of the device. The other element here is cyber is not just failure. There is intent behind it, right? Somebody has done something to change something to do it, and so that's that chaotic input there, is that intentionalness of this. It's not a physical failure that we can predict, right? So think about that. And then the other element here is the risk is the business owner's decision. And this is the piece that hospitals, healthcare organizations often struggle with the most, right? Is like, who owns these decisions? And the only way to do it is to really have those conversations, but it comes down to the business owner. What is the point that this risk is no longer tolerable, right, in order to do that? And if you think about healthcare, it's what healthcare is all about all day and every day, right? A physician, think about the most basic thing, right? You go to your physician, right? They look at the symptoms that you present with, right? They do some tests, they get some data, and then they say, what are my treatment options? And when they consider the treatment options, they say, what can I do that will get the best result with the least amount of harm, right? That's risk management at its very core, right? And that's what we do here. So asset management, I've just put these on to kind of point out the differences between how HTM and IT thinks about it, because they're culturally different, and they should be, right? So, but it doesn't mean we can't work together. We shouldn't have to clash, right? We should be able to mesh these kinds of things, right? So we look at, the install base, we do incoming inspections, they do standards compliance and risk assessments. We look at the asset ID or the RFID. We're focused on the makes and models. They look at IP addresses, MAC addresses, the OS and the patch levels, right? We do passive scanning. They do that. Really what it comes down to is we look at uptime requirements, and they do SLA, service level agreements. So, it's that you're never more frustrated when you call IT, to get the status, of the ticket that you opened yesterday. And as soon as you're off the phone, you get in there another ticket, for that phone call that, that check the status on another ticket, right? So one of their agreements is, or one of their service level components is how quickly they can open and close tickets. And so they get what they asked for, sort of some of those unintended consequences there. Secure procurement, we have to think about, along with, the other piece, the clinical benefits, the financials, the serviceability, the risk management, right? We also now have to think about, is it secure to operate? Is it future safe, right, on here? So we've got to bring security into that conversation. It shouldn't just be that 270 questionnaire that IT sends out, right, wanting to know all of the different variables that go into the device. But we have to begin to start thinking, how are we going to manage the security risks while this device is in our environment? What is the manufacturer's patch cycle? Is it every 4 months? Is it every 6 months? Is it every 12 months? How will we know that there's a new patch out? Who's going to install the patch? How much time do we expect it to take? Who's going to do the return to operation once that patch is installed? So these are the things that we have to understand as biomeds, so that we can continue to change the oil, if you will, on these medical devices and keep them running on here. So legacy equipment, right? The AHA often says the useful life of medical devices is between 7 and 12 years. We know, right? Stuff is lasting much longer than this, right? So the OS goes out of support, right? We've got stuff that's Windows 7. You know, I've talked to people that are still operating medical devices that are running like Windows NT, you know, and interestingly enough, they're probably more secure because nobody's trying to figure out how to hack NT anymore, right? Because they just assume it's not there. But the thing is, the the OSs will go out of support long before we're ready to get rid of our medical devices. And one of the things that we do when we, you know, when stuff goes to the end of support, end of life, we look at it from a cost perspective, and we say, how much more will we pay to keep this device running before we say we've got to change the device out and replace it, right? And we begin to plan for that. And so we now have to think, what do we do? What's the risk threshold that the organization is no longer willing to tolerate on this device? Because that risk is going to continue to accumulate over time. And we should be monitoring and, you know, measuring those risks, and then knowing that at this threshold, you know, this organization is no longer willing to accept it, and then we get it on that capital planning schedule. Doesn't mean that it's going to go away right away. We know how that works. But if we don't plan for it, we'll never get there. So begin to incorporate that into your processes. Maintenance, right? There's a couple of things, and physical access becomes very important when we talk to this. A lot of the exploits that happen are available on medical devices require physical access. And so, you know, we have to think, you know, where do we store these devices? I just can't plug them into those bank of outlets, you know, next to the elevator, you know, to charge my ECGs while they're not in use, right? We have to think about that. Maybe put port blockers in so nobody can, you know, stick a USB drive in or plug it into an RJ45 cable, you know, other elements like that. So think about part sourcing. You know, we've got operator's manual and then user training, right? The other piece is we've got to be able to correlate the different responsibilities to the different teams. And that means that we've got to correlate the CMMS ID, right, to the CMDB ID, whatever that looks like for them, for the IT team, so that they can manage the IP address and the other elements that they're responsible for the interoperability of the device. And we can manage the functions that we have for maintaining the device's clinical functionality. If you're not familiar with a RACI, become familiar with a RACI. This is the way to assign that responsibility. Who is going to take care of what tasks on here? And this is a very simple one, but the RACI really is about responsible is the doer, accountable is the decider, right? Consulted means they're advisors, and informed means kept abreast. So really what you do is say, on one side, you've got the tasks, across the top, you've got who the doers are, what are the roles that take care of this. And for your devices, you should say, all right, well, who's going to take care of this? Secure configuration goes to the HDO technology team. So they're both responsible and accountable. The thing is, you can only have, you know, one accountable person per task on here. So that's the only element in the RACI. You know, it doesn't have to be everybody else on here, but these are very, very useful for helping to negotiate who's responsible for that, right? If we look at, and I've got, if anybody's interested in this, I've got a more complex view that we're working on. That's a tool that's for use, right? Monitoring, who's going to monitor it? We can leverage the folks with the IT team. You know, oftentimes for med devices, we have to have some passive monitoring tool. You know, that information should go into a SIM. They need to know what to do with it, what it looks like. So now we've got yet another tool that's got a different asset ID that we've got to coordinate correlate the IDs on. So keep that in mind, right? But we can check, you know, changes in failure rates. This is stuff we look at, changes in failure types, lost or missing assets, right? Things like that. So monitoring is important, right? For us to understand response, and this is really planning, you know, how to return this device to operations. And that's really the biomed role, not always the IT role. They're often like, oh, we need to know who does this stuff. And so you need to think, you know, like, how can I get this back to service and still not, you know, cripple what IT needs to do for their role, because they do have, forensics responsibilities. They need to be able to protect a much larger, enterprise. When we talk about safety on medical devices, it's usually one-to-one, right? It's one device, one patient at a time. When we talk on the IT side, it's a one-to-many relationship, and that many can be thousands. And so we have to respect that from a cultural reputation on that. The other thing is we should do an organizational impact, and we do risk assessments inbound. Is this a life safety device? Is it monitoring? Is it physical therapy? Is it therapeutic? What's the environment that it operates? What's the failure rate? So on and so forth. In that, we now have to begin to think is like, what does this device mean for the clinical operations of our organization? So does it have patient data on it? And does it have big patient data? And I say big patient data because 500 records is the number of records that makes that a publicly notifiable breach, so it has reputational impact. So if you think about an ISAC analyzer that will hold 2,000 patient studies, if one of those goes missing, you've got to report that loss to, HHS. Your organization has to report that loss, track all the patients that were studied on that device, and make sure it's there. So things that we can do as biomeds, right, is to reduce the number of records on any given device, whether it's an ISAC analyzer, if it sits in the cradle, then it should just wipe whatever records are already transferred to the EHR and no longer need to be on that device, to minimize the risk to our organization. Whether it's on your image scanners, for diagnostic imaging, whether every time a biomed type, does it, say we're going to wipe out everything but the last 100 studies, because the next time I touch it, it should only go up to 400, say, another 300 studies, I'll touch it again and then I'll wipe those out. So if that were to get replaced, and this has happened, these computers end up on a pallet in the parking garage, and all of a sudden that pallet is lost because somebody came in and said, oh, look at those, there's a whole pallet full of computers, and just decided to take them, right? So now we have a publicly notifiable breach. So we have to start thinking about, not just securing, the components themselves, but also securing the data that's on those components on that. And I am going to run out of time before I get to the end of this. So disposal, I'll say this about disposal. You've got to plan for disposal when you bring a new device into your system, right? Make sure, how are we going to separate PHI from the functionality of the device? Is there another port for a second hard drive? Can we push that out? Can I push the data to my data center where it's better managed and not park it on the device itself? If I do park it on the device, once it's in the data center, can I get rid of it off the device? Elements like that, and then when the device leaves, your IT team is going to want to scan it to, probably mil-spec data deletion, but because you're using a single hard drive, that's going to take care of your operating system, your clinical application, and it'll take any value of that medical device off there as well. So you want to take care of that. So a couple things, clone the hard drive, push the data to that, plan for disposal, and not just the data that's on there, but also, it could walk out the door with, your network credentials, your network, if they get the IP range, which used to be in clear text on all of your infusion pumps. Well, now they know the IP range of your wireless network in your hospital. So that's intelligence that folks can use. So again, you got this, right? Key takeaways, right? Understand the risk, consistent prioritization based on clinical impact. What happens if this device fails to our ability to deliver care, right? Understand that the business owns the risk and get them to do it. And this is a team sport. So do one thing, right? Go back to your hospital, go back to one of your key departments that you operate in, and ask them, right? Given all the devices that are in here, if you were to lose one device for 4 to 5 days, which device would cause you to shut down what you do, right? And when you give that to clinical leaders, to your radiology director or your clinical lab, director or whomever, right? They begin to, okay, and then you can start putting plans together like, okay, well, let's talk about what are the risks to this device and how can we protect that? You start collaborating with your IT teams on there. So If you're interested in learning more about security, ISC squared, that's, you can read that, right? Has certified in cybersecurity. It is free to take the online course. It's about $275. You have to join ICS, 75 bucks. Take the test, 200 bucks to get certified in cybersecurity. It is a great language, right? It gives you the basic principles of cybersecurity. It allows you to have meaningful conversations with your IT and your IT security teams on that. Right, a little bit about me. I've been here for a long time. This is my contact information. If you're interested in more, asking me questions, whatever, please feel free to reach out. I'm here to help the community as a whole. And thank you so much. I think we've got just a few minutes for questions. I don't know if that's possible remotely, but I'm happy to entertain them.